Woken up after a full night's sleep and still felt exhausted, not physically tired. Your body. Have you ever woken up after a full night's sleep and still felt exhausted, not physically tired? Your body feels fine, but mentally, emotionally, you're just done. Someone asks what you want for dinner, and you can't bring yourself to care. A friend invites you somewhere, and the thought of going feels impossible. Not because you don't like them, but because existing around other people requires energy you simply don't have. You scroll through your phone, not because anything interests you, but because doing anything else feels like too much effort. You're not sick, you're not depressed. Exactly. You're just tired of everything. This isn't just temporary burnout or needing a vacation. This is something deeper, more persistent, and more psychologically complex than most people realize. The feeling of being exhausted by life itself, not by any specific thing, but by the weight of existing, trying, caring, hoping, and continuously showing up day after day. It affects millions of people in ways that go far beyond physical tiredness. Understanding this psychology reveals something uncomfortable about modern life and what happens when people reach their emotional and psychological limits without even realizing they've been pushing toward them. When researchers study people who feel tired of everything, they discover something fascinating. This isn't laziness or lack of motivation. It's not depression in the traditional sense, though it can exist alongside it. This is what psychologists call emotional exhaustion, a state where your capacity to feel, care, respond, or invest in anything has been gradually drained. Your emotional resources aren't just low, they're completely empty. And unlike physical tiredness that sleep can fix, this exhaustion doesn't improve with rest, because it's not your body that's tired, it's something deeper. But how does someone arrive at this psychological state in the first place? The path to being tired of everything rarely happens overnight. It's usually a gradual process that builds so slowly you don't notice until you're completely empty. Maybe it started with caring too much for too long. You poured yourself into your job, your relationships, your responsibilities. You showed up for everyone, handled everything, carried more than your share, and for a while, you could manage it. You were tired, sure, but you kept going. Or perhaps it began with disappointment after disappointment. You tried hard at something and it didn't work out. You trusted someone and they let you down. You hoped for something and it fell apart. Once, you could bounce back, but each disappointment took a little more energy than the last. Each time you got back up required a little more effort, and eventually, getting back up one more time felt impossible. Not because you're weak, but because you've done it too many times already. Each of these experiences creates what psychologists call accumulated strain. Think of it like a phone battery. Every time you care about something, try at something, hope for something, you're using battery power. And normally you recharge, you rest, you get support, you have wins that refill your energy. But when you're constantly giving without getting recharged, when disappointments come faster than you can process them, when demands never stop long enough for you to recover, your battery.
Some people, most people instinctively think that there is some kind of meaning to life. They just sort of assume that it's there. In the same way that you ask them, why are you getting out of bed? To go to work. Why are you doing that? To make money. Why? To provide for my family. Why? To bring up my children healthily. Why? Because I want my children to be healthy. Why? What do you mean, why? For some people, they just don't recognize the question. They're just like, what are you talking about? For other people, they hear that and they go, gosh, you know what? Fair enough, I actually don't know. The nihilist is someone who sort of takes a bird's eye view of it and realizes that it's all a little bit meaningless. It is nicer to think that you are here for some kind of reason that's written into the rules of the universe than that it all is just a happy or unhappy accident. My name's Alex O'Connor. I'm the host of the Within Reason podcast. I think I'm best described as a philosophy YouTuber and former edgy atheist. Meaning, I think, is used synonymously with purpose. And purpose is something like reason to act or reason to be. Whenever anybody acts in any way, when I pick up a glass of water to have a drink, when I walk to a bus stop or something, there will be a reason why I've done that. These kinds of behaviors don't just spring up ex nihilo. They exist for some kind of reason. And so if you ask me why it is that I'm reaching my arm over there, it might be because I'm trying to pick up a glass of water. Why am I doing that? I don't just do that randomly. Well, because I'm thirsty. Well, why am I thirsty? Well, now we're kind of into some biological science. You might say, well, it's been a while since I've last had a drink, and then you might describe what it is about my biology that causes thirst, and you might even give an evolutionary explanation for why it is that we've developed this sensitivity to thirst, and eventually this kind of has to bottom out somewhere. It will either have to bottom out in some evolutionary reason, or this contingent chain of reasoning just essentially goes back forever, or it terminates in something which is self-justifying. For the religious, it will be God. Everything they do, even if they don't cognize it all the time, will be for the glory of God. And if you're a secular person, it will likely be something else. For some people, their meaning in life might be the raising of their children. And for most people, it probably is relational. And when people say that they found their meaning in life, I think a lot of the time they found that self-justifying principle. The thing that the nihilist recognizes is that the values he or she holds are not grounded in anything other than their own preferences or aesthetic preferences. Nihilism comes in many forms, and depending on the context can mean many different things, but most broadly it's the lack of belief in or belief that there is no such thing as an objective purpose to life or to the actions that we commit and the behaviors that we portray within life. A lot of people think that if you lived like a nihilist, you'd sort of rot away in bed. Some nihilists may do that, and I think there is actually a strong correlation between philosophical nihilism and practical depression. However,
all three towers back in action. You did good today. Real good. Tonight, I'll raise my mug of cocoa to you.
nihilism is not about the actual consequences or the things that you're doing. It's about the purpose behind them. It's about the meaning behind them. And so, suppose that you're feeling thirsty. I could explain to you that the only reason you're feeling thirst is because of some animalistic drive that you had no control over. But you're still thirsty. You still have that desire. You still have that value of quenching your thirst, and so you'll still do that. And the same applies in all areas of life. Art and music and poetry, but also including relationships, friendships, that kind of stuff. You're still going to want to do those things. It's like Camus famously described in the myth of Sisyphus, this person who suddenly recognizes the structure of their day, waking up, having breakfast, getting in the car, going to work, taking a break, work, going back home, eating some food, going to sleep, starting again. And you sort of start to notice that you're doing this. And it's not anything about what you're doing. It's realizing, taking a step back and realizing that there's no meaning to any of this. There's nothing more than just my doing it. It doesn't go any deeper than that. One of the still greatest expositions of nihilism that can be found in the printed word is the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. Ecclesiastes takes us through the reflections of this man, this anonymous author. Some have tried to identify him, but it doesn't really matter who it is. We know that he was a great man, a king. He lived an illustrious life, but he saw no meaning in it. And he keeps coming back to this word, heaven, which means literally something like wind. And so it's translated as vanity by the King James. Vanity of vanities. Everything is vanity. Meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless is one translation. Absurd, absurd. Everything is absurd is my favorite. It's like, I denied my eyes no pleasures because if I wanted something, I took it. I drank wine, I partied, I lived life. But in the end, I saw that it was all hevel. It was all just wind. It's just nothing. It just happens, and then it's gone. And it doesn't mean anything. The most interesting thing is that it seems to suggest that everything that this guy was saying was true. That it is all just wind. But that somehow, by just fearing God and keeping his commandments, you have somehow solved the problem. I don't think that that's a very satisfying solution. But then I think that that is the great theme of nihilistic literature. People try for a kind of solution, but ultimately, for me at least, they seem relatively unsatisfying. Fast forward thousands of years and you get Albert Camus' myth of Sisyphus, which famously ends with this idea of imagining Sisyphus happy. In fact, Camus is celebrated for the starkness of the opening line of the myth of Sisyphus, that there is one serious philosophical question, and that is suicide. He says everything else, how many dimensions there are to space, whether abstract numbers exist, all of that is secondary. The most foundational question is whether or not you're going to, as he once put it, have a cup of coffee or kill yourself today. You look at the seeming arbitrariness of the world around us, the way that the environment and the organisms within it seem to just sort of almost randomly evolve according to literal just battles for survival. I think people want something a little bit more than that. They want something which feels worthwhile, that's somehow sort of justified by some universal principle. There's almost like a moral element, that it's a good thing to be alive, that it's a good thing to live a meaningful life. And that kind of thing I think is very difficult to ground objectively. In fact, if somebody ever asks me how I might console myself in the face of these existential woes, genuinely, at least personally, it is in agnosticism. It's in the fact that I do not know the first thing about why any of this exists. Of course I don't, And sometimes people ask me in a context on a podcast or on a stage or something, implicitly as if I'm going to have some answer, as if I've worked it out and I'm going to be able to communicate that to people. And I'm interested in philosophy, so I might have read something that helps to elucidate a concept, or I might be able to put a word on something that you've been thinking but didn't know was also thought by other people. But we're doing the same thing here. And ultimately, I have absolutely no idea what the ultimate answers are. And so that kind of consoles me. And I suppose I'm just not convicted of nihilism. It's a very difficult thing to define, famously, like concepts like good and bad, but we employ them all the time. Like, what is the difference between a murder just occurred and it's wrong that that murder just occurred? If you try to isolate what the actual difference is there, I think it has to just be an attitude. It's an expression. It's the way you feel. And so the only thing that can be added by saying that something is wrong is the expression of that attitude. My name's Alex O'Connor. I'm the host of the Within Reason podcast. I think I'm best described as a philosophy YouTuber and former edgy atheist.
How emotivism shapes ethics.
Some people, they just don't.
Isn't there? Where you think you are. We are always looking for someone to carry the weight for us. It has always been like this. It will always be like this. Someone to blame, someone to explain, someone to absorb the responsibility we refuse to hold. We say the fault is the past, childhood, parents, trauma, society, biology, history. My mother was anxious, my father too, their parents before them. And so we keep walking backward through time, digging deeper and deeper, hoping that if we go far enough, we'll find a final explanation. Until we reach Adam and Eve, until we reach the original myth of guilt. And there, in the garden, something deeply unsettling happens. God places a tree at the center of paradise and says, "Not this one." If he truly didn't want them to eat, silence would have been enough. Silence always is, but by pointing, he creates desire. By forbidding, he plants curiosity. By naming, he condemns. That wasn't a mistake. It was a trap. When Adam is confronted, he doesn't take responsibility. We never do. He points to Eve. Eve points to the serpent. And the serpent smiles. Passing the blame forward is older than religion, older than morality. It's structural. The universe was never designed to be obedient. An obedient universe would be dead. No surprise, no risk, no story. A God who controls everything, predicts everything, knows everything is a bored God. And maybe that's the real hell. Not fire,
Just there
not
near the
punishment.
river should be a good place to set up your base of operations. In the meantime, we're being asked to do some quick repairs on the building so that it doesn't fall apart. Just gather the resources and get it over with. You know better than me by now.
but absolute boredom. That's why, in the Jewish tradition, God places something strange inside the human being. The Yetzer Hara, the errant impulse, the conscious flaw. Not absolute evil, just enough deviation, like salt in a soup. Enough to disrupt perfection. Enough for something unpredictable to happen. Enough so that even God doesn't fully know what comes next. And this is where things become uncomfortable. Because what's at stake isn't morality, it's identity. Who are we? Why do we feel displaced? Why does living feel like an obligation instead of an event? We believe survival is a duty, that existence needs justification, that waking up requires a reason. Now imagine for a moment that you were God, in the most literal sense, all-powerful, all-knowing, everywhere. You would know every ending before the beginning, every answer before the question, every consequence before the choice. And then, what would remain? Nothing but emptiness. So you would want to forget. You would want not to know. You would want to get lost inside your own creation. And here lies the ultimate taboo. To know you are God is considered madness. The mark of insanity, we're told, is believing you are God. That's why it must be denied, repressed, crucified. Jesus wasn't killed for being good. He was killed for knowing who he was. Religion made a silent agreement. Fine, he can be God, but only him, no one else. But that was never the original revelation. The revelation was always collective, universal, silent. In the East, this was never scandalous. Discovering your divinity wasn't heresy. It was awakening, not in an egoic sense, not I am special, but this is looking through me. When I look into your eyes, I don't see just you. I see the universe trying to recognize itself. That's why forgetting is necessary. We must pretend we don't know who we are. So the experience has intensity. So there is fear, loneliness, alienation. We say, I came into the world. But that's an illusion. You didn't come into the world. You came out of it. Like fruit from a tree, like a baby from a womb, like a wave from the ocean. We are symptoms of the universe, nerve endings of existence. The cosmos doesn't think in abstractions. It feels through us. That's why there are many of us. So the point of view isn't singular, so there's no final bias. So reality can observe itself from every possible angle. And so we do what we always do. We try to understand what's happening. We build telescopes to look outward, microscopes to look inward. And the more we look, the more everything escapes. The farther we see, the more the universe expands. The deeper we investigate, the more particles appear. We thought we found the atom. Then came the electron, the proton, the neutron, then chaos, antimatter, fields, full emptiness, probabilistic realities. Reality isn't becoming more confusing. We're becoming more precise. We are a system trying to observe itself. A snake eating its own tail. A mirror facing another mirror. We ask, who am I? But try to see your own head. Right now, you can't. It isn't dark. It isn't blurred. It simply isn't there. Where you think you are, there is nothing. And that's where everything reveals itself. We think space is empty, that it's nothing, that it doesn't matter. But space is the foundation of everything. Without space, there are no stars. They emerge from nothing. Sound emerges from silence. Form emerges from emptiness. Being emerges from non-being. Just as man emerges from woman. Not the other way around. If you listen closely enough, without trying to extract meaning, something disturbing appears. There is no past. There is no future. And there is no one listening. Only this instant, observing itself. And maybe that's exactly what you would do if you were God. At the end of every question, there is no answer. There is silence. Not an empty silence, but a heavy one. Ancient, almost sacred. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, doesn't explain, and doesn't save. It simply remains. Human beings are terrified of this space. That's why we talk so much, think so much, create narratives, systems, religions, ideologies, goals, purposes, legacies. Anything to avoid the brutal perception that nothing is waiting at the end. Consciousness was not a gift. It was a sophisticated accident. Nature didn't need to be observed. It existed perfectly without witnesses. But for reasons that will never be clarified, it folded in on itself and began to look. And in that gaze, a fracture emerged. Thinking is a crack in wholeness. Feeling separate is the price of self-awareness. Since then, we've been trying to close that fissure, trying to return to something we don't remember being, trying to recover a unity that only exists as metaphysical nostalgia. We call this spirituality, but underneath, it's homesickness for something that was never individual. Human pain doesn't come from suffering itself. It comes from insisting on interpreting it, from desperately trying to assign meaning to what simply happens. The universe doesn't explain, it executes. There is no justice in how things function. There is blind coherence, repetition, cycles feeding on themselves. Birth, desire, loss, illness, aging, death, not as tragedy, as pattern. Modern spirituality fails because it tries to anesthetize this perception. It turns the abyss into a motivational message, the void into purpose, silence into promise. But the void promises nothing, and that's precisely why it's real. Perhaps humanity's greatest mistake was confusing meaning with emotional survival. Not everything that is true is bearable. Not everything that is real is welcoming. Some truths don't heal, they clarify. And clarity doesn't bring peace, it brings lucidity. Lucidity is seeing there is no secret plan, no hidden reward, no guaranteed redemption. Existence isn't going anywhere, it just happens. And then, it stops happening. The most honest mysticism begins when we stop asking the mystery for answers. When we understand that mystery isn't a puzzle to solve, but a condition to endure. The mind wants closure. Reality offers none. That's why the silent despair that follows every human being from early on. That's why the anxiety that success, love, faith, or recognition never resolve. None of these touch the core of the unease. Because the problem isn't what's missing. It's the fact that nothing is missing. And something still hurts. Nihilism is not the denial of life. It's the refusal to lie about it. It's looking at existence without metaphysical makeup, without backstage promises, without moral guarantees. And paradoxically, that's where a deeper spirituality emerges. Not one that promises ascent, but one that accepts the fall. A spirituality without heaven, without salvation, without witnesses, only presence. Presence not as practice, but as inevitability. You are here. That's already the maximum event. There is no hidden lesson in suffering, no mandatory growth in loss, no guaranteed transformation in pain. Sometimes something breaks, and that's it. Sometimes someone leaves, and nothing better comes afterward. Accepting this requires more courage than believing any comforting story. Existential maturity begins when we stop demanding that life treat us like protagonists. When we accept we are local events in an impersonal process. And still, we feel, we love, we fear, we desire. Not because it serves a higher purpose, but because this is what happens when matter thinks. Maybe the final point isn't hope, nor despair. Maybe it's sobriety, ontological sobriety. No spiritual euphoria, no theatrical pessimism. Just the recognition that being alive means crossing something that didn't ask for you and won't remember you. And yet, you cross, Not because it makes sense, but because there is no alternative. And if there is any form of freedom here, it is this: the refusal to pretend, the refusal to sweeten the abyss, the refusal to turn mystery into emotional product, to see clearly, to feel deeply, without apologizing to chaos. Maybe that's the highest dignity available. Not an answer, but a steady gaze into the silence. You're still here. That already says something. Most people leave at the first discomfort. They scroll away the moment the words stop entertaining and start exposing. If you stayed, it's because something in this content touched a nerve you didn't know how to name. This channel doesn't exist to make you feel better. It exists to make you see. And seeing has a cost. Every video here is built against the algorithm, against comfort, against spiritual sugarcoating. It doesn't promise healing. It doesn't offer hope as a product. It doesn't flatter you or pretend everything has meaning. It respects you enough to tell the truth plainly. And the truth is this: if you're watching, you're already part of something rare. A small group of people willing to sit with silence, ambiguity, and ideas that don't resolve cleanly. Just watching helps more than you think. Sharing the video already pushes back against noise. Being here already matters. But if this content resonates with you, if these words feel like something you've been circling your whole life, if this channel feels less like entertainment and more like recognition, then becoming a member is not just support, it's alignment. Membership isn't about perks alone. It's about sustaining a space where depth is still allowed to exist, where ideas aren't diluted to survive, where honesty isn't punished for being uncomfortable. As a member, you help keep this channel independent. You help ensure that the content stays sharp, uncompromising, and free from distortion. You're not buying access. You're helping protect a signal that refuses to lie. And if you want to go even further, Super Thanks is a direct gesture, a quiet acknowledgement, a way of saying, this mattered to me. Not because you owe anything, you don't, but because when something speaks to you at this level, there's a natural impulse to give back, to keep it alive, to make sure it continues. Still, hear this clearly. If all you ever do is watch, that is already enough. If all you do is listen, that already helps. If all you do is stay until the end, you're already contributing. Support is never demanded here. It's invited. This channel survives because a few people recognize themselves in it and decide not to look away. If you're one of them, you know what to do. Stay, share, join if it feels right. Use Super Thanks if you want to leave a mark. And if not, that's okay too. You being here aware, present, undistracted is already more than most will ever offer. Thank you for listening. There is a quiet cruelty hidden in human desire. Not the loud kind, not the violent one, but the slow, invisible cruelty of longing for something we believe will save us. In Fantoches by Enrico Verissimo, we are invited into this silent cruelty, a story that does not scream, it whispers. And because it whispers, it stays. At the center of the narrative stands the sad man, a man whose life has been reduced to observation. He does not live, he watches. From a distance, he stares at a window. Inside that window, a young woman exists, or at least, he believes she exists in the way he needs her to. She becomes his son. Isn't that?
stand beside. Our brains don't want us to experience total darkness. I don't mean this in a poetic, metaphorical way. I mean literally. There are very few places in nature where it's even possible to blot out all illumination. Outside, even a moonless, overcast night can't shut out the light of the stars. But say you're determined, dead set on escaping the glow of our world, you could head underground. In a cave, you will find dark in the truest sense, a blackness unsullied by the least bit of natural light. Even then, alone in a cave, without a moon or sun or flashlight, your brain will fight against the dark. Mere hours into total darkness, humans start to hallucinate. You don't have to have a history of seeing things. Fully healthy, self-aware, otherwise lucid people will swiftly and dramatically start to hallucinate in true darkness. In 2004, researchers in Massachusetts blindfolded 13 participants for 96 straight hours, and yet the participants saw many things. Flashing lights, a rotating skull, illuminated trails following their arms. One woman said she saw a splotch of light, quote, in the exact form of Elvis Presley. Another woman sensed that she was standing in front of a mirror and was terrified by the sudden appearance of a green face with big eyes. A man said he saw full landscapes, trees, pebbles, running water, all in the absence of any light at all. In 2007, the German artist Marietta Schwartz blindfolded herself for over 3 weeks. Scientists monitored her over this period, during which she witnessed hallucinations as simple as leopard print and as complex as the opening credits to Star Trek. Scans of her brain indicated that she was not simply imagining these things, but actually seeing them. The hallucinations activating the same visual processing centers of her mind that she would use to see real leopard print, or the actual opening credits to Star Trek. These experiences happened within controlled laboratory environments, but over the course of human history and art, many more people have confined themselves to a much more isolated form of darkness. They too experienced their minds fight against the absence that confronted them. All of us, willingly or not, confront the dark every day. It is the bedrock of the universe, an absolute inevitability, a required element of life and death and rest and time, and yet we refuse to simply perceive the dark. Rather than sit within total absence, our brains spin imagined stimuli out into the void. After all, how could there truly be nothing there? Over the years, I've talked about the depths of the earth, the stillness of the cold, the unknowable reaches of our oceans. Each of these is merely an extension of the dark. That black, that abyss, that place we cannot see is not merely a fear, it is the fear. The place from which all others are born. I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished,
and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space.
In November of 2021, a woman named Beatriz Flamini descended into a cave in the south of Spain. Her intention was to remain underground and isolated longer than any human in history. She almost did it. Flamini is notable in her submission to the dark because of her general enthusiasm for the whole process. Despite helpers bringing her food and supplies, she specifically chose not to directly communicate with the outside world. No talking with others, no updates on current events. She would have a couple battery-powered lights, but no clock or externally updated calendar. She would not see another human face for 500 days. Because she didn't bring a mirror, she would not even see her own. She was, however, provided with a pair of GoPros. She would use these to record the whole experience. Remember these. Her fixations on dark and isolation and disconnection are unusual, but not wholly unique. The man she was attempting to take the record from was named Milutin Vjokovic. He was a Serbian scientist who spent 464 days in a row inside a cave. Vjokovic had a radio through which he could talk to people outside, but that communication did not spare him the effects of the dark. He hallucinates. His hair grows long and ragged. He pulls out his own teeth. Or there's the French speleologist Michel Siffre. In 1962, he ventured into a cave for 2 months straight. A decade later, he returned to the dark for another 6. He found that his perception of time inevitably warped. Weeks after he entered the cave, he tried to mentally time 2 minutes, and it took him 5. Occasionally, he stayed awake for 36 hours in a row, though he didn't know it. When he was retrieved from the cave, he was surprised. Why are they pulling him out? Isn't he only halfway through? My psychological time had compressed by a factor of 2. When Flamini emerged from the cave in 2023 after a year and a half of residence, she seemed thrilled with her time. She told writer DT Max that her stay was excellent, unbeatable. She took a series of medical exams and all her vitals were normal. Her attitude seemed almost unbelievable. She hadn't been affected at all by her years in the dark. But the GoPros tell another story. The first thing they document is her loss of time. On day 38 of the experiment, she says to the camera, "I'm convinced that if I get past day 30, it's a done deal." Then the auditory phantoms enter the picture. She begins to hear things, or more specifically, she begins to hear a thing. This is not paranoia. This is not hallucinations, she whispers to her GoPros. If it's an animal, it's a big animal. She was always alone in the cave. To enter, one had to rappel down a 200-foot sheer drop, but she was convinced there was something there with her. 300 days in, Flamini breaks. She blames the router researchers had placed in the cave, says that it's sending out sonic waves that are giving her nosebleeds. She climbs out of the cave but stays confined to her tent at the entrance. Assistants replace the router. She goes back in. And the more she talks about the dark, the more her initial report, excellent, unbeatable, seems like an attempt to rationalize, maybe even repress, her true experience. She later admits, "I didn't exactly lose consciousness, but the darkness saps you of life. The solitude, the social uprooting, it consumes you. You eat, you down nutrients, but you consume yourself." Because of Flamini's brief exodus from the cave, she fails her record attempt. Vjokovic's 464-day stay in the 60s still bests her, but I wonder how much the record matters to her now, how much importance she puts on the exact amount of time she spent in the dark. The cameras, the other scientists, they monitored how long she was down there, but Flamini experienced something different. A while ago I was born. A while ago, I was going to visit Mongolia. There is no past, there is no future. Everything is present, everything is a while ago, and it's all brutal and strange. Michel Siffre was more blunt about his time in isolation in what he called the terrifying sensation of infinite space. He wrote, "I now understand why in their myths, people have always situated hell underground." And this is the language of the people most eager to explore the dark. Here's an obnoxious question for you. Can you see the dark? Well, is water wet? Can you see the dark? Say I have a room in my house without illumination. The door is open, but no light can make it past the threshold. Are we seeing darkness in that room? Or would it be more accurately described as an absence of perception? I don't have an answer for you, not one that would meaningfully change your experience of the dark. Semantical explanations can't contend with lizard brain fear instincts. But can you see the dark is a revealing question because it breaks down all the abstract language we so often use to talk about it into a single base anxiety. Here's how I would describe the fear of dark once you suck all the poeticism out of it. Either there is nothing there, or there is something there. That's it. That's all there is. Either the dark conceals something, or the dark reveals nothing. As a kid, I'd occasionally punish myself by reading some of the most frightening works of American literature ever published, the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark book series. They are, rightfully, most remembered for their illustrations by Stephen Gammell, inky works of absolute cruelty that elevated otherwise pretty benign, spooky stories. But there was one notable exception. On page 45 of More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz, there's a story called The Voice. It is 114 words long. I'm now going to read it to you in its entirety. Ellen had just fallen asleep when she heard a strange voice. "Ellen," it whispered, "I am coming up the stairs. Now I am on the first step. Now I am on the second step." Ellen got scared and called her parents, but they didn't hear her and they didn't come. Then the voice whispered, "Ellen, I'm on the top step. Now I'm in the hall. Now I'm outside your room." Then it whispered, "I'm standing right next to your bed." And then, "I've got you!" Ellen screamed and the voice stopped. Her father rushed into the room and turned on the light. "Somebody is in here," Ellen said. They looked and looked. Nobody was there. This story ruined my goddamn life. I was particularly susceptible, I guess. My childhood bedroom was immediately at the top of a flight of stairs. I didn't close my door at night for some reason. And so instead, I would lay in bed and stare down the flight of stairs, darkness pooling at the bottom, and I would think about the two options. There's nothing there, or there is something there. This anxiety is leveraged throughout horror media. Most relevant to our previous discussion of Flamini and the Underground is Neil Marshall's 2005 classic, The Descent, a film that lets the audience stew in the stress of its claustrophobic subterranean darkness for nearly an hour before revealing its cannibalistic humanoid underground dwellers. The composition of these before scenes is wonderfully minimal. Often nearly the entire frame is left black. A single headlamp may provide some light, but only enough to highlight the surrounding dark. Many scenes are horribly rooted in their physical space, like this skin-crawling push through a tunnel. And yet, the film's refusal to further light the frame simultaneously abstracts the space. Everything outside the confines of this tunnel exists only as a void, an amorphous threat always on the verge of swallowing the characters whole. The Descent does have an easy escape for the viewer, though. For as tense as it is, we can reassure ourselves, never in a million years would I put myself in that position. That reassurance ceases to work when darkness envelops the domestic. This is why I couldn't shake Schwartz's The Voice. This is still where my most visceral fears manifest. Gerald's Game is a fairly middling Stephen King book that happens to contain one of the most electrifyingly scary scenes he's ever put to paper. The book centers on Jessie, a woman left handcuffed to her bed after her husband unexpectedly dies whilst preparing for coitus. Unable to escape the cuffs or leave the bed, Jessie is left alone in a cabin, too remote to call for help. As the book goes on, she flickers in and out of reality, mixing her present predicament with her life's previous traumas. And then, she meets someone else. She passes out in the evening and wakes in the middle of the night, her arms stiff, her muscles cramping after hours of being handcuffed. She starts to talk to herself. How long can she go without food? How long can she go without water? And then, she stops. Her eyes, which have been wandering aimlessly across the darkened room, locked on the far corner, where the wind-driven shadows of the pines danced wildly in the nacreous light falling through the skylight. There was a man standing there. Terror greater than any she had ever known crept over her. Her terror had blown her mind temporarily clean from wall to wall and ceiling to floor. No sound escaped her, not even the smallest squeak. She was as incapable of sound as she was of thought. She didn't black out, didn't even come close to it, but that mental emptiness and the total physical incapacity that accompanied it were worse than a blackout. When thought did attempt to return, it was at first blocked by a dark, featureless wall of fear. A man in the corner. It's absurd how many of my own childhood anxieties manifested as little more complicated than a man standing in the corner at night. A coat over a chair, a shadow across a bookshelf, a creak of the floorboards, all would near immediately become that most horrifying of apparitions, a man in the corner. And like I did, Jessie immediately tries to talk herself out of it. She's being crazy, she thinks. It's just the dark and moonlight and her own psyche manifesting horrors. But she doesn't believe her own rationalizations. She can feel him, slow waves of malevolence emanating from the corner of the room. Kiddie horror show's Anatomy, an indie game I've spoken about at length before, manifests this same anxiety. The player, after wandering around a cold, dark house, finds themselves trapped in the bedroom, and the narrator intones, "It is here, in the bedroom, that we are at our most vulnerable. Anything might stand beside us, watch us, keep us company until dawn, and we would never perceive it. We can only pray that the house will not let such things carry on while we sleep. It is here that the house is most likely to betray us." There is a unique menace that a room can hold in the dark, particularly when suddenly awoken into it. The ordinary turned uneasy, familiar corners now posing a single dreadful question. Is there nothing there? Or is there something there? It's the same reason, and I'm embarrassed to even admit this, that I hate looking out windows at night. My body tenses up at the idea that the nothing outside could suddenly hold something. A man standing in the corner. In Ian Reid's book, I'm Thinking of Ending Things, the protagonist describes an incident in which she awoke in the middle of the night, looked out her window, and realized someone was standing outside. A tall man, so tall in fact that his head was above the top of the window. But despite this, she is sure he can see her. In Anatomy, the narrator analogizes windows as the eyes of a house, says it's hard to shake the feeling of being watched when encountering the lightless windows of a tall, dark manor. They describe the windows as eyes as gazing out at their surroundings, but at night, when I'm alone, I can't help but feel that they've turned inward, that it is now the dark that watches me through each window. The protagonist of I'm Thinking of Ending Things watches the tall man outside for a long time, maybe an hour, and then, unexpectedly, subtly, he waves. The wave changed everything. It had an effective malice, as if he were suggesting I could never be completely on my own, that he would be around, that he would be back. After that, I thought it would reoccur, that he would appear again, watching. But it didn't. Not at my window, anyhow. But I always felt like the man was there. The man is always there. Back in Gerald's game, Jessie continues to stare at the shadows in the corner, forming the shape of a man. Her mind untethers. Things especially changed in the dark when a person was alone. Who knows what some men and women have seen in the hour of their solitary deaths? Is it so hard to believe that some of them may have died of fear, no matter what the words on the death certificates say? The shadow doesn't speak, but it leans forward into the moonlight out of deniability. It smiles. And something in Jessie's mind makes a decision. Some part of her brain senses that this dark is too deep, that any more time here will somehow break her irreversibly. A piece of her starts running for these circuit breakers in her head, racing against the panels of her psyche that have begun to smoke. That small piece of her mind throws the breaker because fear-induced unconsciousness is preferable to even one more second in that room with that man in the corner. There was an intolerably bright flash inside her head, and then the lights went. The largest blackout in history happened on the 31st of July, 2012. It doubled the previous record, which just happened to have been set the day before. At about 2:30 a.m. on July 30th, an electrical line in India running from Bina to Gwalior tripped off. The line's failure immediately cascaded across northern India's grid. Plants in Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan, Delhi, Uttarakhand, Jammu, Kashmir, and more all went down. In total, 300 million people lost power. Trains stopped on their tracks. Water treatment plants ceased functioning. Hospitals went dark. For most, the outage lasted less than a day. 80% had power back by that evening. Well, they did, for almost 12 hours. On July 31st, a similar sequence of failures occurred, except this time it didn't stay confined to the northern power grid. Weakened from the previous day, the extreme load pulled down the northeastern and eastern grids as well, plunging literally 670 million people into darkness. That is, if you need further context, twice the current population of the United States. Infrastructure ground to a halt once again. Trains, hospitals, water, all kaput. In a true nightmare scenario, 200 workers were trapped in a coal mine in West Bengal, their elevator to the surface suddenly non-functional. It cannot be overstated how much the advent of electrical lighting has changed our functioning as humans. Our pattern of sleep, formerly segmented into multiple shorter periods, has been artificially stitched into one extended rest. We've used our ability to define the night as an opportunity to redefine ourselves. We are no longer creatures built in parallel to the rising and setting sun. The lights only go out when we choose. But it's an impermanent change. Take away electricity, return a human to a day defined only by the sun and the moon, and their sleep will return to a pre-industrial schedule, 2 shorter sleeps separated by hours of gentle wakefulness. It is alarming how thin the line is between self-definition and submission to the schedule of the solar system. In India, in 2012, 500 million people suddenly returned to a dark beyond their choosing. It is one overloaded line and an interconnected series of power plants. In 2014, the Wall Street Journal reported on a leaked report from the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. The report detailed the vulnerabilities of the country's electrical system. Namely, even though the U.S. has more than 55,000 electric transmission
know you're tired. You were born into suffering. And everything you do to escape it only makes it worse. Every desire you
This is supposed to be a
chase.
simple survey operation. They had an earthquake recently. Did quite a bit of damage to the area in general, and the steel mill in particular. We don't quite know the full extent yet. So, you just need to get in, find out, and get out. Nice and easy, right?
Every goal you set, every moment you spend trying to feel better, is just another turn of the wheel that grinds you down. Schopenhauer saw through this trap 200 years ago, and what he discovered is both terrifying and liberating. Because buried in his brutally honest philosophy about why life is pain, he found something unexpected. Not a cure, but an escape hatch. A way to step outside the machine, even if just for a moment. And it has nothing to do with success, or happiness, or any of that nonsense they've been selling. Look, I know you're tired. Tired of the grind, tired of pretending that if you just work a little harder, or buy the right thing, or fix yourself in the right way, everything will finally
Looks
feel
like fun times ahead. As exciting as surveying is, it's a little more than that. Who could have guessed, right? The company wants you to retrieve some valuable mining equipment.
Your most engaged viewers have told me exactly this. One of you put it perfectly. I know all of this and I hate the system that makes us slaves, but we have no choice because we have to pay our bills. The slaves have three options, you say. Suicide, slave work, or crime. And you're right to be looking for something better, because all three of those options are just different flavors of the same poison. This isn't going to be a short video. This is a deep dive. 2.5 hours where we're going to explore one of the most important philosophical discoveries ever made. A discovery about suffering, about consciousness, about what it means to be trapped in existence, and how you might, just might, find moments of genuine freedom. We're going to understand why Arthur Schopenhauer, this angry German philosopher that most people have never heard of, figured out something that could actually save your life. Not metaphorically, actually. By the time we're done, you're going to understand the logic of suffering, why it's built into the structure of existence itself, why you can't think your way out of it, or achieve your way out of it, or love your way out of it, and more importantly, you're going to understand the one thing that actually works. The escape hatch that's been sitting in front of you your whole life, that you've used without even knowing what you were doing. We're going to make it conscious. We're going to make it deliberate. We're going to give you a tool that actually functions in the real world, not some positive thinking garbage that falls apart the second things get hard. This first part is about understanding the prison. You can't escape something if you don't know what's holding you. So we're going to start with the man himself, Arthur Schopenhauer, because his life explains a lot about his philosophy. Then we're going to dive deep into his central concept, the thing he called the will. And finally, we're going to understand exactly how the will creates suffering, necessarily, in every moment you're alive. This is going to be dark. But stick with me, because the darkness is the only honest starting point. Everything else is just people lying to make you feel better temporarily. Let's begin. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in 1,788 inches, what's now Gdansk, Poland, but was then the free city of Danzig. His father was a wealthy merchant, successful, pragmatic, the kind of man who believed in business and money and the real world. His mother was Johanna Schopenhauer, who became a somewhat famous novelist in her time. And right from the start, young Arthur didn't fit. He was moody, difficult, saw through people's pretenses in a way that made them uncomfortable. His father wanted him to become a merchant. Schopenhauer tried it, hated every second, and when his father died, possibly by suicide, though that's debated, Arthur finally had the freedom and the inheritance to do what he actually wanted. Study philosophy. He went to university, studied under some of the big names of German idealism, and immediately realized he thought they were mostly full of it. See, this was the era of Hegel and Fichte, philosophers who were building these massive, optimistic systems, where history was progressing toward reason, and spirit was unfolding toward perfection, and everything meant something. Schopenhauer looked at the actual world, the world of pain and death and meaningless suffering, and thought these guys were delusional. He said Hegel's philosophy was empty word juggling, philosophical charlatanism. He wasn't diplomatic about it, so Schopenhauer went his own way. He read voraciously. He discovered ancient texts on Buddhism and Hinduism that were just starting to be translated into European languages, and something clicked. Here were philosophies that took suffering seriously, that didn't pretend life was basically good with some unfortunate rough patches. That started from the premise that existence itself is the problem. This resonated with something deep in Schopenhauer's own experience, because by all accounts, Schopenhauer was not a happy man. He was paranoid, kept loaded pistols by his bed because he was convinced someone would break in and kill him. He had terrible relationships with women, including his own mother, who basically told him he was unpleasant to be around. He never married, lived alone with a succession of poodles, all of which he named the same thing. He was bitter about his lack of recognition, his books didn't sell well during most of his lifetime, and he spent decades watching lesser philosophers, in his opinion, get all the fame and attention while his work was ignored. But here's the thing, that bitterness, that darkness, that refusal to pretend everything was fine, it made him see clearly. He wasn't invested in believing the world was good. He didn't need to convince himself that life had inherent meaning, or that people were basically noble, or that hard work led to happiness. He could look at existence without rose-colored glasses and report back honestly about what he saw. And what he saw was suffering. Everywhere. In everything. Built into the structure of being itself. His major work, The World as Will and Representation, was published in 1818 when he was just 30 years old. It's a massive, dense book that nobody bought. The first edition barely sold any copies. Publishers kept remaining. Schopenhauer was crushed, but he also knew he'd written something true and important. He spent the rest of his life expanding on it, defending it, waiting for the world to catch up, and eventually, toward the end of his life, it did. He became famous, influential, read by artists and musicians and writers who recognized something in his philosophy that spoke to their experience. Wagner loved him. Nietzsche was obsessed with him before eventually breaking away. Freud acknowledged his influence. Tolstoy, Proust, Thomas Mann, they all read Schopenhauer and found something there that the optimists couldn't provide. Schopenhauer died in 1860, finally recognized, finally vindicated, but still fundamentally alone. And his philosophy is, in a weird way, a philosophy of aloneness, of individual consciousness trapped in a body that wants things, trying to make sense of existence that doesn't make sense. But before we get too deep into the emotional tone, we need to understand the actual structure of his thought. We need to understand the will. So, what is the will? This is the foundation of everything Schopenhauer believed, and it's easy to
I have a
misunderstand.
whole menu
So
of things for you to do. 1, connect the tunnel exit base to the steel pipes facility. 2, make some room at the port so we can get your gear shipped over. 3, replace the gas tank at the concrete plant. You can find a replacement at the gas station. They have plenty, so they won't miss it.
A journey inward, a journey that asks nothing of you but to simply listen, to let go, and to rest. You don't need to remember everything. You don't need to analyze or take notes. This is not a test. This is an invitation to release the weight of the day, to let your mind settle like dust after a long journey, and to allow the wisdom of Carl Jung to gently guide you into a deeper, more peaceful state. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Feel the surface beneath you, supporting your body completely. Notice your breath, in and out, natural and easy. There's nowhere to be, nothing to prove, no one watching. Tonight, as you listen, you'll hear about silence, about turning inward, about the power that comes not from striving, but from stillness, and perhaps without even trying. These ideas will weave themselves into your dreams, planting seeds that will grow quietly while you rest. Jung understood something profound about the human soul, that transformation happens not in the noise of the world, but in the quiet spaces we create within ourselves. And what is sleep, if not the ultimate act of surrender, the ultimate silence? Each night, we release our grip on consciousness and trust that we will return, renewed. So let this be easy. Let the words wash over you like waves on a shore. Some will stay with you, others will drift away. And that's exactly as it should be. As you sink deeper into relaxation, remember, you are safe here. Your body knows how to rest. Your mind knows how to let go. And in this space between waking and sleeping, you are exactly where you need to be. Now, let's begin. Have you ever wondered, why do we expend so much energy explaining, proving, or seeking acceptance from others when our very own selves have never truly been heard? Carl Jung, who devoted his entire life to exploring the essence of the human soul, revealed a truth that most of us evade. Happiness does not reside in being recognized, but in self-recognition. Jung termed this journey individuation, a process in which you must courageously venture inward, gazing directly at what you have always avoided: chaos, fear, and the shadow aspects. So, what truly happens when you pause, withdraw your energy from the external world, and begin to focus utterly inward? What shifts when you choose silence and allow the outcomes to speak on your behalf? That journey is not for the superficial. It demands that you confront the emptiness in the absence of surrounding noise and summon the courage to accept that truth sometimes echoes only in silence. But it is precisely in that moment that you uncover a different form of power. the power of one who channels all energy into inner growth and to becoming the most authentic version of oneself. The question is, are you ready to embrace silence, cease explaining, and let your actions and very presence declare it all? Part 1. Why is silence powerful? In a world where people seem endlessly vying to speak out, to prove themselves, to be seen and acknowledged, silence becomes a rare luxury. We have grown accustomed to responding instantly, to saying something that fits the moment, to defending our views lest we appear weak. Yet, Jung illuminated a profound paradox. It is precisely when we dare to be silent, when we refuse the compulsion to voice ourselves, that we truly enter the realm of inner power. Silence is not merely the absence of words. It is a state of consciousness. It is the moment when we withdraw energy from external distractions to return inward. In Jung's language, this is the instant when we allow the unconscious, that profound layer often obscured by the clamor of daily life, to begin to speak. When we are caught up in speaking, we hear only the echo of the ego, the social mask persona we've donned to adapt. But when we halt, when we fall silent, the shadow rises, the repository of repressed parts, denied emotions, and true power can only emerge when we dare to confront it. Consider a very ordinary situation. You find yourself in an argument with a colleague or loved one. In that tense moment, instinct urges an immediate retort, a need to prove you are right, that you are not being dismissed. But once the argument cools, you realize most of what you said holds no meaning and may even have worsened the situation. In contrast, if you choose silence, granting yourself a few deep breaths, you gain the clarity to see the bigger picture. Silence is not defeat. It is a form of control. Control over energy, emotions, and the very dynamics at play. This is the power that noise can never attain. Modern psychology confirms this. When entering silence, the prefrontal cortex, the hub of thinking and decision-making, gains space to operate. Freed from limbic interference, we see clearly and choose wisely. Thus, the pause functions as a pause button, restoring the brain's balance and yielding sharper decisions. This clarity is the tangible form of power not born from shouting, but from the ability to see clearly and choose rightly. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Silence is the path to that process. We cannot heed the unconscious amid noise. Just as to hear the sound of a stream, we must step away from the bustling marketplace. Silence provides the environment for dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious. And from that dialogue, we uncover archetypes, sources of creative energy, clues to our true selves. From another angle, silence is
with aliens, it's weird because people think there's ends or perfect.
Just of physicists. So I just wanted to start off by asking, and how was it that your physics training ended up merging with biology?
It's a great question. I think It's interesting to me because wanting to be a scientist, I was
Let's clear up all
not
the damaged containers at the port. How about trying that crane? I know you're not technically authorized to use it, but I won't tell anyone if you don't.
really thinking about disciplines. I just got really excited about physics and the sort of mindset of the physicist, which is, in my mind, like the enterprise of theoretical physics is to come up with the deepest, most abstract explanations for reality. And it doesn't really matter what parts of reality you're trying to describe. It's just the process of doing it in that kind of way, like finding very deep mathematical regularities to describe these things that we think are universal patterns in nature. And when I started studying physics, I was particularly interested in the idea that the human mind could come up with new theories and test them. So I remember very vividly being in my physics class at a community college. So, like first year physics, it was, like very informal. And being really romanticized by this idea that we could predict the existence of magnetic monopoles. So like they're, an interesting physical object. It's, a magnetic pole has a north and south. If you cut it in half, it still has a north and south. So some physicists had proposed this idea that you might have an isolated north or south pole, and this could be an interesting physical object in the universe, and we could find it because it would prove some new ideas about physics. And I thought it was kind of insane, actually, and amazing and beautiful that people could be sitting here on Earth thinking these thoughts about what could be possible in the universe and then build technology to go and find it. And so that was actually that connection between our ability.
Make your mother proud. The barge should have all the parts we need to put the water pump components together. Why don't you get those parts off the barge and we'll see what's what.
Hey, I'm going on a tour of the United Kingdom, sent off Alpsten or Philip. Is science, on its own, enough to understand the universe?
The universe, maybe. Yeah, I do think that there are plenty of questions out there that science is not up to the task of uniquely answering. Maybe those questions include things like mathematics, which is sort of purely formal and logical and would be true either independently of whatever the scientific facts about the universe were. I would also say that things like morality and aesthetics are not out there in the universe, except for the fact that they're invented by we human beings who are part of the universe. But I do think that science is up to the task of explaining what the universe is and what happens in it, and that's basically science's job.
You're one of those people it's difficult to know where to even begin, given everything that you cover in your work. But I think that perhaps one sort of overview picture here is on this question of what science does. You just said that science explains. I often speak to physicists who say that really the job of physics and science is to kind of make predictions about the future, and really all it does is like observe things that happen and sort of describe the things that happen and use that to make predictions. Other people think it's got explanatory power, some think it's purely functional. What do you think is the actual role of science? What can it do for us?
It's interesting that scientists are so bad at this themselves, but that's why we have people like philosophers of science, historians of science, sociologists of science, etc. I mean, if you were talking to an archaeologist and you tried to make the claim that the purpose of science was to predict the future, they would be like, what are you even talking about? You know, I think that different kinds of science have different capacities. I just like to say that science describes the universe, the past, present, and future of the universe. In physics contexts, physics contexts are very special because physics has this remarkable ability to simplify complicated things down to the essence of just a few moving parts, and that gives us the ability to make predictions with wonderful precision in the future. So we tend to valorize that or almost fetishize it, like that's what we want to be able to do. But there's a lot more to science than that. Certainly people who study the cosmic microwave background in cosmology, the leftover radiation from the Big Bang, they're doing science, I'm pretty sure, even though they're not trying to predict the future. So I think of science as doing its best to find a model of the universe, of how reality works. Whether you count that as an explanation or not is more a philosophical question or even a linguistic question. But if we have a mathematical or at least a super well-defined formal structure that maps onto the universe in a definite way, then that's the goal of science, to achieve such a thing.
Well, does that satisfy you in terms of the word explanation? I mean, you know, maybe it's something that you're agnostic about, I'm not sure, and you say it's a question for the philosophers. Then again, you are a professor of natural philosophy.
I do count myself, yes, I can put on that hat.
Gosh, you got those parts off without a hitch. Now we need not only a route, but also a road that takes us between the port and the workshop inside the concrete plant. Maybe you can use the nearest sand quarry for the first part of the road. bit of a situation in the steel mill there. Well, more like a burst water pipe, but still. Find the damaged spot and patch it up. And while you're at it, see if you can lay out a route from our base to the steel beams facility.